Welcome to On Air, a podcast discussion at the intersection of artificial intelligence and international relations, where we will discuss the development of IR theory, law, and practice in the age of AI.
Welcome to Season 7 of the IR in the Age of AI podcast. I'm your host, Medlir and Chris, joined today from Tokyo, Japan by my co-host, Chris Lamont. Chris, how are you doing?
Oh, doing well. And Tokyo is ever-changing. In particular, Medlir, we've moved into this new campus building closer to the center of Tokyo, so adjusting to life in the new premises in this new, more urban environment than the previous campus.
So as always, I'm the king of timing, so I leave just as the university moves to nicer, bigger settings. So that's great. I'll just have to arrange for a visit.
But definitely, we definitely need to arrange to have you come back to Tokyo again soon.
Well, I have you recorded now, so I can always play it back. Well, Chris, today is a special episode, not only because it's the first of the year, 2024. I don't know why, but this feels like a really big year, especially when we talk about artificial intelligence. We ended it with some commotion, especially with OpenAI, one of the biggest actors when it comes to the one that most people are familiar with in terms of the interaction with artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. But so that's big from that front. So this is the first episode of the first year of this year. But also because today we're actually both very excited to officially announce that the podcast's new home, the Brussels-based Global Governance Institute, where Chris and I actually will lead the AI and Global Governance program. Now, to learn about GGI, as we'll refer to it, Global Governance Institute, as well as for a stimulating conversation on the present and future of global governance, we've actually invited in our program my dear friend and colleague, known each other for more than a decade, Dr. Joachim Koops. Dr. Koops is a graduate of Oxford University and University of Kiel. He is a board member of the Global Governance Institute and a senior expert in the Peace and Security and Global Education section. He is also a professor of security studies and former scientific director of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Joe, welcome to On Air.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Medlir. Hi, Chris. Great to be on.
Well, it's exciting. Again, as I said, we've known each other for a long time, back when we worked in Brussels together. And of course, Europe is like a meeting place for all three of us. I know that Chris had his academic start also not far from Leiden. You were up in Groningen, Chris?
Yeah, so I was up at the University of Groningen in the far north of the Netherlands as an assistant professor after having finished a postdoctoral fellowship in Northern Ireland, prior to that doing a PhD in Scotland. So I've been around the northern fringes of Europe.
So here we are today. I am sitting here in Mountain West, United States. Joe is in...
I'm in Brussels, yeah.
Okay, all right. You're in Brussels. And then Chris, you are in Tokyo, Japan. I don't know how we made this work. I think I'm the one sacrificing most sleep here, but I'm willing to pay the price. Well, Joe, let's start with a quick introduction. What is GGI, Global Governance Institute? What is its mission and your vision for it? And what are we doing with it? I think we'll probably address that part at the end, but let's start with those first two questions.
Sure. Well, it's an independent, not-for-profit think tank that was created in 2010. I was one of the co-founders. Back then, it was created by three colleagues of mine that all worked in different areas of mostly peace and security issues, but also environmental governance, and also one person from the private sector. One of the co-founders, for example, was also Benedikt Franke. He then also went on to become the CEO of the Munich Security Conference, so he branched out in that field. And the other co-founder, Christoph Datschel, both of them still on the board. He was, back then when I met him, the chief of staff of the UN Standby High Readiness Brigade for UN peace operations. That was the brigade created by Denmark, the Netherlands and Canada after the terrible triple UN disasters, peacekeeping disasters and atrocities of Rwanda, Srebrenica and Somalia. What really brought us together was a deep concern for how peace and security issues are governed and tackled, but also more generally then, how a variety of collective key pressing challenges that cross borders, how are they actually governed, how are different players at the state level, but also non-state level, NGOs, international organizations, how did they respond to it? And that is squarely then the broad field of global governance, so to say. So we worked on a lot of issues before, but it was that time in 2010 really clear, okay, we need to create an institution here that deals with the entire spectrum of global governance issues, but also really focuses on, because all of us were strong believers and still are in the UN and the UN system.
Right.
So with all of its limitations and challenges, particularly now as we're talking, it's becoming even more visible. It is still the only global mechanism, global system that addresses on a variety of issues global problem solving. And it is the institution that's worth saving, worth improving and strengthening. I think this should be almost a citizen responsibility in many ways. So it was important for us to found a think tank on the one hand that looks at global governance, that looks at the UN, but also increasingly regional organizations that have become active. One of them, where I'm sitting now in this city in Brussels, the European Union. And not only in its own right, the EU has done a lot of things on the continent here in terms of integration, addressing peace and security issues and so on, but also because it has at least the ambition to play a global role and to play a role in global governance. And if we look at the last 20 years of foreign policy statements, it's all about strengthening the UN system, so-called effective multilateralism, how to make it better. Now, whether or not these statements, bold statements, translate into policy impact and whether they're always successful or even always genuine, that's a different question. But if we take the assumption now that, okay, we've got on the one hand the UN system that really deals with the full spectrum of all global challenges and in many areas that are maybe less visible, quite successful. In the high-profile issues, think about, Gaza, think about Ukraine, a variety of also issues in the Security Council. Yes, it's visible that there are huge, huge challenges, but a lot of agencies in the background deliver a lot of major public goods. So on the one hand, that aspect, and then how regional organizations are actors in global governance in their own right, but also how they support the UN system. So those were the big questions we had back then.
Right.
Then we founded the think tank in Brussels. That was the whole point, to have both connections to the EU, but also in Brussels, there's a huge UN presence to make sure the conversation is not only about the big two, EU, NATO, but also about the UN system. And it was important for us to dedicate a think tank that really strongly, from all perspectives, focuses on the UN system and how to improve it in many ways. Long answer to a short question.
No, it's a fantastic answer to that. And I appreciate, I think, going back and I think touching on all these issues, because I think contextualizing that particular mission, I think, is very important for everybody. In off air, we were talking a little bit about changes that have occurred in recent months and years within GGI. What's your vision for it, where we are right now and where you see it going forward?
GGI, again, was founded 2 years after the financial crisis. It was focusing on global governance when really the term itself was, you could see it in documents, you could see a variety of scholars that were interested in that topic would still talk about it. But in most national strategies and political dialogue, it wasn't really that much of a huge topic anymore. It was pottering in the background. It was taken for granted. Yes, cooperation is important, but okay, more than that really wasn't visible. And now, 2024, we see now global governance back in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons, because of the absence of it, or because global governance is under major attack. The very assumptions or the core beliefs that cooperation is important, that cooperation needs to be advanced between the big powers, between a wide range of actors that matter in international politics, that we have shared norms. Think about international humanitarian law, the idea of protections of civilians everywhere. Yes, we always had challenges to that, but now it's almost as if it's shaken to the core. Do we still take these norms seriously? Can we still uphold them? All of these questions are global governance questions. Again, for all the wrong reasons we're talking about it now. We also see major powers. The first time I heard global governance as a term, again, in recent years in the General Assembly, was when Donald Trump actually talked about global governance, but in a negative way. It seems like there is this global governance, and he did the classic thing, which is confusing it with global government. And that's not the idea of it. It's not that you have a central authority that sends a global army and controls everyone. No, that's not the idea. The idea is that governments, national governments, are still in the driver's seat, but you agree on common norms and you have global approaches to collective problems. But so you had all of a sudden global governance as a key enemy almost. And then if you think about Lula, who was elected in Brazil again, he straight away said, okay, we need to strengthen global governance in India. Modi, before the G20 summit, he last year, he was also saying global governance doesn't work, we need an alternative form. So, okay, then let's talk about it. What is the alternative form? Is there a better way? And how do we then promote it? So it's that thing. And then related to your research area, and we're excited about this. Yeah, technology, emerging technologies and global governance. What are the opportunities and challenges and risks? So I think these things all are now pressing issues, and we can talk for hours about the UN, its effectiveness, the legitimacy, and so on and so forth. So plenty of things really that are now in the spotlight again, I think.
And I think one thing that's really interesting that you captured there was a shift from when GGI was founded in 2010 to 2024 in terms of how we conceive of global governance, debates about global governance, but also this idea that global governance is somehow in crisis today in a way that it wasn't in the past. There's these challenges that you've mentioned, calls for alternatives, and you alluded to Modi's, like what would that look like? How do you see global governance going forward? I think we mentioned off air previously, there's a lot of global governance that we don't talk about, that we tend to focus on certain aspects of global governance that seem to be more salient at a given point in time. So sometimes we might lose sight of bigger trajectories. So how do you see the trajectory of global governance going forward in this decade?
Yeah, I think maybe talking one step back quickly, what is it? So we quickly talked about what is it not. It's not global government, and it's not this dystopian view of the central authority. It's exactly, in many ways, the opposite. And essentially, it's a process, and that's important. It's a process, not an outcome, of trying to bring the different interests of different players together for global problem solving. So we all have collective, pressing, fundamental policy challenges that cross borders, that not one single country can solve. The classic, most obvious one is climate change. You cannot say, okay, we're now unilaterally, as one country, as Belgium, we're going to tackle climate change. That doesn't work for obvious reasons. You need a collective approach to that, and the planetary approach, if you want. Technology as well, that will affect every single citizen and country across borders. How do you deal with, back then the classical and the Cold War, the classical issues was, and it's coming back now, the nuclear threat. This is a global threat. It will affect. Maybe there was a report recently that the least affected region might be New Zealand if there's nuclear war in Europe, but even that will not help much, because the fallout on the economy and everything else will affect also even those countries where maybe the immediate effect. So that's a fact, also driven by globalization and interconnectedness of all countries and citizens. And so the response, or the feeling of going back to protectionism, of wanting to have some certainty where you just focus on your immediate neighborhood, will unfortunately be a little bit closing your eyes in front of those realities. And interesting is also the term itself. So the principle has been around as long as there's been interconnectedness of continents, and communication has really risen. Even in the lead up to the First World War, this was a period of one of the most interconnected periods, again, of the globe in terms of communication, transactions, trade, and so on. So this has been around at least a century. But the term itself was coined by a report in 1995. There was a commission on global governance created by the UN. Back then, Secretary General Boutros Ghali in 92 was asking for, okay, we have a new world order. The Cold War was over. We were in this interregnum. So as Antonio Gramsci calls it, the old order is dying. We still don't know what the new order is. Precisely, again, I think where we are now. So for Boutros Ghali, it was important to get bright minds together and think about, all right, what are the challenges? How do we approach it? And they came up with a very good report called Our Global Neighborhood. So yes, neighborhoods are important, but we have it, unfortunately, in a globally connected way, or also fortunately, for many ways. And they termed the coin, we need for these challenges to approach them a global governance approach. And that's a complex process where NGOs are involved, individuals are involved, governments, international organizations, to try really to solve these. So there we are, as I mentioned, with 30 years ahead now, where I think, again, in the period where it's unclear where we're heading, where some of the core assumptions about our own national context, about our way of living and cooperation are being shaken, and we're not entirely sure yet where it's all going. So I think, even though we talk a lot about the return of power politics, geopolitics, just a year ago, I think I see the mushrooming of institutes that focus on geopolitics as an indication, again, also of how this is becoming more and more important. But still, geopolitics is just one reality of interactions and power distributions. But how, again, are those relations between emerging powers and reasserting powers managed is a core question. interesting things will be also about how the development of technologies might help or might hinder this. With big data, there's a lot of and possibilities of analyses for, let's say, decision-making, for foreign policy, for cooperation on the one hand. On the other hand, also a variety of risks, I think, when we think particularly about AI. And some problems are just simply perennial ones. You do a great podcast on international relations and AI. Those hacks that are interested in international relations know the question of war and peace is the founding question of international relations, and as old as humanity. And that is now also back at the forefront. These conflicts and atrocities become even more visible now. Rwanda was catastrophic, but it wasn't witnessed by everyone around the globe in real time. Now we're seeing really atrocities and violations of international humanitarian law in real time unfolding with a click away. And that also, I think, will do something to the international community, so to say, on the hot.
I think you're absolutely right that it should do something to international community and also our individual responses, except for I personally don't see changes. In Rwanda, we were late responding to what was an act of genocide, and we have seen in recent time in various conflicts where we have witnessed war crimes or crimes against humanity. Just look at what's happening to Rohingyas, and we know in real time what is happening there. And yet, I feel like at this point, technology, its main function at this point is to reveal our true selves rather than reveal what is happening. I don't know if that makes sense, but now that we have the information, we're still not acting. So perhaps the lack of information was not the problem all along, but rather lack of willingness to respond in real time, I think, to these kinds of actions.
That's right. Yeah, and I would even go one step further. Technology might also now actually contribute to more negativity and more problems, because now it's not only about knowing what's going on, but also not knowing what's going on, because technology is being used for information for misinforming, deliberately misrepresenting, really appealing to, let's say, with distorting the facts to emotions that are leading then to domestic pressures in all the wrong way. So yes, you're absolutely right. Knowing more about it doesn't necessarily lead to more action. It's a bit more, unfortunately, it's a bit more complex than that, and politics gets in the way. But it can also actually lead to the opposite by dehumanizing victims, by portioning blame to the wrong side, inciting, a global audience on many things. So,
Well, because you've addressed these questions, and Chris was hinting at those as well. But I want to push you a little bit further if I can. I'm just going to combine a couple of strands of thought, and I'll rely on you to make sense of them. But it's this issue of that critical approaches to international cooperation. So as Chris was hinting at earlier, there's been a lot of charges that governance, or at least global governance itself, has problems with enforceability of international laws. We just talked about that. Disparities in power and resources among nations, issues of legitimacy, representation. And then when one looks at the state of international systems and of the challenges that lie ahead, it's hard to avoid these issues that, again, we're just talking about, whether it's increasing complexity and interconnectedness of issues. So it's not just the environment, but environment plus climate refugees, plus conflict. And so all of these things are interconnected, hence the need for global governance in a way to address these kinds of issues. But then you have these shifts in global power dynamics, then you have challenges to multilateralism. The more we look into the future, the bleaker, and I don't want to sound this way, we look at this, I think, like I said, 2024 seems like an ominous, very important year. There's been a lot of terms about inflection years, hinge point, all kinds of things, both from technological perspective, but also just secular historical trends. How do we ensure that the ongoing stability of the international system is maintained? How do we avoid a complete breakdown? What role can global governance play?
Yeah, I think you put the finger on the key challenges: enforceability, accountability, legitimacy. How do we make sure the rules that we all agree on, or in long, hard process of negotiations and treaties, are actually then implemented? That's one of the core problems of international relations, international law, and also then by extension global governance. And that is a very difficult one that, of course, we see in many instances that it's not working because lots of big powers, smaller powers float or break international law, break international norms and rules that we all agreed on. But the key thing, I think, and I don't want to sound too unambitious here, is to first acknowledge that we have those rules in the first place. That's not a mean feat. So the fact that we agree on a global scale and we have countries signed up to a common baseline standard against which we can then judge each other and others and their actions and always go back to and say, no, we see there is a deviation of what we all agreed on, and this is what we're going to do about it. That's a huge step forward and shouldn't really be underestimated. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so in 1948, that's not a long time ago when we actually finally managed to all collectively agree on these are the baseline standards that every citizen on this planet is allowed to ask for, and we actually are required to implement at the governmental level and at all different levels. So I think that should be the starting point. It's a similar conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals, where if we look now at the halfway report of the Secretary General, we see we're behind on all goals at this time. At 2030, we should have reached them all. We're really not on track at all. But the very fact that we are having a tracker and that we all agreed on where are we right now in the global health, so to say, or the well-being of the planet, is already in many ways a quarter there, because then we really agreed on what does a good planet look like and what do we need to do to get there. Are we on track? No. Member states appearing to speed up on it? No, the opposite. But that's the framework, and I think that's important for global governance, that we can always get back to at a table and say, but this is what we agreed on, this needs to be done, and then we need to mobilize it. So that as a starting point. Now, how do we enforce sovereign states that are themselves, by the way, the bearers and key pillars of global governance? We always think, often we make this mistake, we think, oh, global governance doesn't work, a war has broken out. Well, the UN must obviously be a completely useless project here because it didn't do what it said to do. Yeah, but I think the first thing is clarity on who are we talking about. So UN scholars also, like Thomas Weiss, talks about 3 UNs. There's the UN of the Security Council, so the key P5, the member states, Russia, China, the US, France, and Britain. They have the primary responsibility for peace and security. Then you have the UN of all nations, 193 nations. And then you have the UN of the Secretariat of the agencies, the World Food Programme, the UNDP, and so on. And we need to zoom in, okay, who do we mean is responsible now for what? And we have a lot of conversation and spotlight now on the UN Security Council. And even there, a lot of scholars now say the UN Security Council is now beyond repair, it is no longer working, it is entirely paralyzed, and of course it's not working as it's supposed to, but they still manage to agree at least on certain, they disagree on lots of things, but they still manage to pass resolutions and agree on certain things. For example, still renewing, despite a lot of posturing and politics involved, on a humanitarian corridor in Syria to deliver vital humanitarian aid. That wasn't obvious. There was a lot of posturing there from different players in the Security Council, but they managed. If we think about a resolution on the humanitarian exception of sanctions, how to make sure that sanctions don't hit innocent civilians. The Security Council last year passed a resolution on a new peacekeeping mission in Haiti, a completely new form. It's going to be led by Kenya with a lot of local states, and then it's not a UN peacekeeping operations in its traditional sense, but a kind of coalition, and so on and so forth. And the other thing, the Security Council also functions in a way that it isolates very often states that are flagrantly violating its own rules. So Russia is becoming very, very clearly isolated. But anyway, does it mean there's an agreement on everything? Does it mean it's effectiveness and accountability all the time? No, it isn't. So at the end of the day, it's again the power play and diplomacy of states with all the vanities, national interests, and hidden agendas, with all the power differentials. This is a fact of international relations that we cannot ignore, and we do it at our peril. Global governance can often lead to some kind of naive optimism, I think. I think realist optimism is important here. And for that, we need to also acknowledge first what are the actual underlying power dynamics and different factors at play. So some things are lipping on, other things are emerging. Often maybe we also don't put the focus enough on it. In last spring, at the height of tensions between China and the US, they managed in the UN to agree on a really path-breaking high seas treaty, for example, that manages to advance a global governance approach to 30% of the oceans, the world's oceans, which was to become a protected area. And it was because China, the US, and the Europeans pushed together in the UN system to get this through and across the finishing line. This was in negotiations for 20 years. So you do see acts of cooperation possibilities in the framework that still works, even though you have, of course, undeniable challenges on many, many other things, including unspeakable atrocities unfolding without, it seems, any kind of effective intervention.
So Joe, so from what I gather, in a sense, listening to you, that there is one key thing that's different is that there is a shared expectation for global governance, even if global governance is not necessarily delivering the outcomes that people might expect at this given point in time. But I think one of the things when kind of thinking about evaluation of anything that's happening in the world today, this brings me back to the kind of discussion a little bit earlier about, well, what has really changed since the atrocities that took place in Rwanda, Bosnia, and Somalia. And I think that one thing that is different in terms of how we learn about these events is that today everything is mediated by algorithms, from social media to the kind of the types of news that we see, the types of stories that we see when we do searches. And that wasn't the case in the same way in the past. In fact, to zoom in on the topic of this podcast and this research initiative, if you think of the Japanese Diplomatic Blue Book for 2023, which kind of sets out Japan's key national security priorities, notes that kind of these emerging technologies not only have the potential to radically change society, kind of how it's organized domestically, but it also affect the balance of power between states and economic and technological competitiveness. And so zooming in on that question of technology, how do you see the challenges of governing critical and emerging technologies being addressed by the institutions and rules that we have today?
Yeah, this will be a classic and interesting topic and a fundamental topic to not zoom in on, because you have all the ingredients of what makes both global governance really important on it, because it's, again, a global factor that will affect the majority of people on this planet. You have a variety of actors with hugely diverging interests. You've got the private sector, you got governments, you've got foreign office officials, you've got ordinary citizens, civil society, and regional international organizations all involved. And you need some kind of shared approach and shared framework, also legal framework, to make sure that the worst risks of this technology are mitigated, but the opportunities are not constrained. So in many ways, the governance of technology or artificial intelligence, let's zoom in on that, is in many ways a textbook case now of global governance. So that also means it's going to be complex and difficult and interconnected. So I already alluded at it. At the heart of it, again, is the private sector. These are hands down driving it. They're developing it in many ways, advancing it, of course, for profit. I'm not saying that you don't have leaders or CEOs that can also think about improving humanity. Often they're driven by idealism, but at the end of the day, it has to be done for profit. You have member states that have already, UN member states that have already realized the huge advantage that can be gained in the international power game through artificial intelligence, and they will resist any constraint or legislation that is not in their interest. And you have regional organizations like the EU with the Artificial Intelligence Act, the UN with different fora and a high-level panel also now deliberating on it that try to somehow put in place guardrails and regulations. And then you, of course, you've got citizens, scientists, scholars working on it, ethics. I think that there are some questions. And this will be a very difficult topic to agree on, but like in any kind of area of global governance, you need to try to identify the actual self-interest of each player, try to guide them through compromise by, at some point, identify first the self-interest, and try to guide them somewhere to a compromise. Again, won't be easy, but we already see interesting developments again at the nexus of regional organizations and global players. So there will be the final stretch now for the EU to try to regulate it. They have a pretty far-reaching approach to it, and it will be interesting to see how that affects, again, its trade relations with different players. So you have this interconnectedness of trade that will also then be affected by the regulations of the AI Act, and so on and so forth. So In many ways, it will be, I think, a textbook example of how to try to get all these different players to agree on minimum standards. And then, of course, the next step, again, as Medlir earlier said, will then be again about enforceability, making sure not only that we agreed on common rules, but also that those that get an advantage by ignoring them will be held accountable. That's, of course, always the tricky question.
Yeah, and I think this is perhaps a good point as we kind of get close to the end of the program today. Obviously, discuss maybe very briefly the new research program at GGI, Global Governance Institute. As we mentioned at the top of the notes, top of the program, we now, starting in January of 2024, the on-air podcast will have a new home with Global Governance Institute. Now, that's part of a bigger kind of infrastructure that we're building around that. And I think this is exciting in light of everything we're talking about. But maybe Joe and Chris, and maybe I can add a little bit to this as well, but maybe Joe, start with you, and then we can kind of take turns. What should our listeners expect from this new research program on AI and global governance?
First of all, we're really, really excited to have you guys.
Yeah, we're too.
Yeah, definitely.
Brought to the Institute, including the podcast. So this is fantastic. I've been an avid listener of it. Really, really enjoyed all your episodes on this important topic. So the Global Governance Institute itself is expanding and focusing on the key contemporary and future issues. And of course, emerging technology will be one, as we just discussed, of the key topics that needs really rigorous, systematic, and comprehensive research. But it also needs outreach, and it also needs an education arm. So what the Global Governance Institute always does is combining research, policy advice, and education. So, for example, one thing that is great that the two of you are advancing or working on right now is the Winter School on Artificial Intelligence and Global Governance. So that would be quite an exciting new project. And of course, this program, a new research program at GGI will also grow. It will bring in more associate fellows. It will bring in people from the policy world that will really look at all the different angles of how emerging technologies can be harnessed, again, for the betterment of society and the planet, identify the core risks, and how the risks can be managed effectively, again, with all the complexity that we shouldn't shy away from. But maybe I'm not the right person to answer it. Maybe the two of you who will actually lead it.
It's a very difficult kind of position to be in, because as you just pointed out, yes, this is something that Chris and we're very grateful, we're very excited that we'll be able to participate in. And I think we're excited to continue this collaboration with GGI. Chris, what are you looking forward to with this new collaboration?
Well, first, I'm really excited. And as Joe mentioned, the getting reunited with Medlir and kind of working with the GGI team in Brussels on the Winter School on Artificial Intelligence is really something that I'm really looking forward to next month in February, despite the cold weather over there. The other thing, I think, is something that we've touched on kind of throughout our conversation, and that's the question of artificial intelligence and uncertainty. Uncertainty in terms of risk, as Medlir and I have discussed many times in previous episodes, have significant disagreements among just how we assess the risk. Is this, as some people say, should we treat it as like almost a sentient life form that we have to like very strong guardrails around? Or is this a tool that's kind of embedded in technology, and we've created the technology and we can deploy that technology to solve the types of societal problems that we encounter? Also, how states will kind of use this technology. And I think one of the questions that we'll probably also keep coming back to is the nature of just like defining this. And unlike some other fields, not only is there uncertainty in risk, but there's kind of uncertainty in terms of application. So there are a lot of different applications that one can use very powerful AI tools for. So as we're all familiar with, image recognition can be kind of fun for just like playing around on the internet, but it also can be a powerful tool of disinformation. Also, things like kind of these programs that can mimic voice. We might be coming into a world in the next few years where anything you watch or listen to that is kind of given to you digitally is something that cannot be believed or you cannot necessarily take for granted. What does that mean for how we begin to negotiate a lot of these problems, both kind of domestically within countries? What does this mean kind of regionally among countries, and also at this global level? So I think that this is a cross-cutting incredibly important issue area that connects with a lot of the other wonderful work that's being done by the Global Governance Institute. So I'd say I'm very excited to pursuing these questions. And also I'd say to listeners to keep an eye out for things like commentaries and policy briefs on the website, because not just kind of Medlir and I and the GGI team, but also kind of other contributors will be coming in to share their thoughts as well.
Well put, Chris. And let me just summarize all of this as obviously the main research program will focus. We can't cover everything, but at least the ambition is to at least cover 3 major research areas or issues. One, of course, is the issue of governance itself, starting at the UN, but also paying close attention to European Union, its member states, and countries in the EU neighborhood. So that's one research area. Of course, another one is about digital authoritarianism. It's a topic we have spoken about here on this program, but it's one that, especially in the European context, is very important. Joe just mentioned this idea of misinformation, disinformation. It's happening, obviously, in the Middle East. It's happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well. So, obviously, it's a very important issue. And it goes beyond digital authoritarianism. It's really about the impact of AI on society and social issues. But we will just label that, at least shorthand, digital authoritarianism. And then, of course, finally, the international law, international security kind of rubric here, which is very important, the impact on autonomous weapons systems, and asking questions whether we need new legal frameworks, what the implementation of these new weapon systems actually may do to our current legal structures, whether we need new ones, whether we need to expand them, or whether they're actually fit for purpose for the time being. So these are very important questions. These are questions that we hope, of course, these are questions that are familiar to our listeners. We've been talking about them for the last 3 years. So in a way, our research program will be a continuation of many of the discussions we have had, and hopefully ongoing conversation with previous guests and also new researchers. As always, of course, we're paying attention, we're listening and looking out for new voices, emerging voices in this field, researchers also, doctoral programs and others. So if any of you are out there, please reach out to us. We'll be very happy to discuss with you and share additional thoughts and opportunities with regards to AI and global governance within the Global Governance Institute. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Joe and Chris. Joe, I must say, this was a very, very, I think, deep and informative discussion. I really enjoyed it. I've missed having these kind of like long-form conversations with you when we were face-to-face. So it's kind of like this was great. Again, flashback for me. So thank you so much. And we've got to have you back on because, again, this was excellent. We're really excited for this new year. Again, I have a feeling 2024, I think, will be really big on these topics, on these issues. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners for your thoughtful comments and feedback. Keep them coming and make us better. And feel free to propose new topics and guests. And of course, don't forget to join us for the next episode of International Relations in the Age of AI, for a discussion at the intersection of AI and international relations, law, and practice. Until then, stay human.